classes!" cried the carrier. "You're the lower classes yourself. If I thought you were a blooming aristocrat, I shouldn't have given you a lift." The words were uttered with undisguised ill feeling. It was plain the pair were not congenial, and further conversation, even to one of Mr. Finsbury's pathetic loquacity, was out of the question. With an angry gesture, he pulled down the brim of his forage cap over his eyes, and producing a notebook and a blue pencil from one of his innermost pockets, soon became absorbed in calculations. On his part, the carrier fell to whistling with fresh zest, and if, now and again, he glanced at the companion of his drive, it was with mingled feelings of triumph and alarm: triumph because he had succeeded in arresting that prodigy of speech, and alarm lest, by any accident, it should begin again. Even the shower which presently overtook and passed them was endured by both in silence, and it was still in silence that they drove at length into Southampton. Dusk had fallen. The shop windows glimmered forth into the streets of the old seaport. In private houses lights were kindled for the evening meal, and Mr. Finsbury began to think complacently of his night's lodgings. He put his papers by, cleared his throat, and looked doubtfully at Mr. Chandler.
"Will you be civil enough,"
said he,
"to recommend me to an inn?"
Mr. Chandler pondered for a moment.
"Well,"
he said at last,
"I wonder how about the Tregonwell Arms?" "The Tregonwell Arms will do very well,"
returned the old man,
"if it's clean and cheap, and the people civil."
"I wasn't thinking so much of you," returned Mr. Chandler thoughtfully. "I was thinking of my friend Watts, as keeps the house. He's a friend of mine, you see, and he helped me through my trouble last year. And I was thinking, would it be fair like on Watts to saddle him with an old party like you, who might be the death of him with general information? Would it be fair to the house?" inquired Mr. Chandler, with an air of candid appeal.
"Mock me!"
cried the old gentleman with spirit.
"It was kind of you to bring me here for nothing, but it gives you no right to address me in such terms. Here's a shilling for your trouble, and if you do not choose to set me down at the Tregonwell Arms, I can find it for myself."
Chandler was surprised and a little startled. Muttering something apologetic, he returned the shilling, drove in silence through several intricate lanes and small streets, drew up at length before the bright windows of an inn, and called loudly for Mr. Watts. "Is that you, Jem?" cried a hearty voice from the stable yard. "Come in and warm yourself." "I only stopped here," Mr. Chandler explained, "to let down an old gent as wants food and lodging. Mind, I warn you agin him. He's worse nor a temperance lecture." Mr. Finsbury dismounted with difficulty, for he was cramped with his long drive and the shaking he had received in the accident. The friendly Mr. Watts, in spite of the carter's scarcely agreeable introduction, treated the old gentleman with the utmost courtesy, and led him into the back parlour, where there was a big fire burning in the grate. Presently a table was spread in the same room, and he was invited to seat himself before a stewed fowl, somewhat the worse for having seen service before, and a big pewter mug of ale from the tap. He rose from supper a giant refreshed, and changing his seat to one nearer the fire, began to examine the other guests with an eye to the delights of oratory. There were near a dozen present, all men, and, as Joseph exulted to perceive, all working men. Often already had he seen cause to bless that appetite for disconnected fact and rotatory argument which is so marked a character of the mechanic. But even an audience of working men has to be courted, and there was no man more deeply versed in the necessary arts than Joseph Finsbury. He placed his glasses on his nose, drew from his pocket a bundle of papers, and spread them before him on a table. He crumpled them, he smoothed them out. Now he skimmed them over, apparently well pleased with their contents. Now, with tapping pencil and contracted brows, he seemed maturely to consider some particular statement. A stealthy glance about the room assured him of the success of his manoeuvres. All eyes were turned on the performer, mouths were open, pipes hung suspended, the birds were charmed. At the same moment, the entrance of Mr. Watts afforded him an opportunity.
"I observe,"
said he, addressing the landlord, but taking at the same time the whole room into his confidence with an encouraging look.
I observe that some of these gentlemen are looking with curiosity in my direction, and certainly it is unusual to see any one immersed in literary and scientific labours in the public apartment of an inn. I have here some calculations I made this morning upon the cost of living in this and other countries, a subject, I need scarcely say, highly interesting to the working classes. I have calculated a scale of living for incomes of 80, 160, 200, and 240 pounds a year. I must confess that the income of 80 pounds has somewhat baffled me, and the others are not so exact as I could wish, for the price of washing varies very largely in foreign countries, and the different cokes, coals, and firewoods fluctuate surprisingly. I will read my researches, and I hope you won't scruple to point out to me any little errors that I may have committed, either from oversight or ignorance. I will begin, gentlemen, with the income of 80 pounds a year.
Whereupon the old gentleman, with less compassion than he would have had for brute beasts, delivered himself of all his tedious calculations. As he occasionally gave 9 versions of a single income, placing the imaginary person in London, Paris, Bagdad, Spitzbergen, Bassora, Heligoland, the Scilly Islands, Brighton, Cincinnati, and Nijni Novgorod, with an appropriate outfit for each locality, it is no wonder that his hearers look back on that evening as the most tiresome they ever spent. Long before Mr. Finsbury had reached Nijni Novgorod, with the income of £160, the company had dwindled and faded away to a few old topers and the bored but affable Watts. There was a constant stream of customers from the outer world, but so soon as they were served, they drank their liquor quickly and departed with the utmost celerity for the next public house. By the time the young man with 200 a year was vegetating in the Scilly Islands, Mr. Watts was left alone with the economist, and that imaginary person had scarce commenced life at Brighton before the last of his pursuers desisted from the chase. Mr. Finsbury slept soundly after the manifold fatigues of the day. He rose late, and after a good breakfast ordered the bill. Then it was that he made a discovery which has been made by many others both before and since, that it is one thing to order your bill and another to discharge it. The items were moderate, and, what does not always follow, the total small; but after the most sedulous review of all his pockets, 1 and 9 halfpenny appeared to be the total of the old gentleman's available assets. He asked to see Mr. Watts.
Here is a bill on London for £800,
said Mr. Finsbury, as that worthy appeared.
I am afraid, unless you choose to discount it yourself, it may detain me a day or two till I can get it cashed.
Mr. Watts looked at the bill, turned it over, and dog-eared it with his fingers. "It'll keep you a day or two," he said, repeating the old man's words. "You have no other money with you?"
Some trifling change,
responded Joseph.
nothing to speak of.
Then you can send it to me. I should be pleased to trust you.
To tell the truth,
answered the old gentleman,
I am more than half inclined to stay. I am in need of funds.
If a loan of 10 shillings will help you, 'tis at your service, responded Watts with eagerness.
No, I think I would rather stay,
said the old man,
and get my bill discounted.
You shall not stay in my house, cried Mr. Watts. This is the last time you shall have a bed at the Tregonwell Arms.
I insist upon remaining,
replied Mr. Finsbury with spirit.
I remain by Act of Parliament. Turn me out if you dare.
Then pay your bill, said Mr. Watts.
Take that,
cried the old man, tossing him the negotiable bill. 'Tis not legal tender, replied Mr. Watts. You must leave my house at once.
You cannot appreciate the contempt I feel for you, Mr. Watts,
said the old gentleman, resigning himself to circumstances.
But you shall feel it in one way. I refuse to pay my bill.
I don't care for your bill, responded Mr. Watts. What I want is your absence.
That you shall have,
said the old gentleman, and taking up his forage cap as he spoke, He crammed it on his head.
Perhaps you are too insolent,
He added,
to inform me of